Hello, 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 and welcome back to IVF in Your Pocket, your waiting room companion. Today's episode is all about IVF transfers. It's your quick summary of all things IVF transfers. If you haven't listened to the previous episodes about IVF tests, it's a good complement to this episode, so go ahead and take a listen if that resonates for you, because some of those tests are what is out there before you go ahead and do a transfer. Your partner does a transfer, your surrogate does a transfer. So, a couple things to know about transfers. The first thing to know is that sometimes there are some obstacles with transfers that can come out of nowhere. It's good to know about them just because it's so discouraging to get a setback when you are that far along in the journey. Oftentimes, what people come up against is thin uterine lining. It can be so very frustrating because optimal lining is about 7+ millimeters of that lining. And estrogen, of course, helps build lining, and sometimes that can just be a struggle for some individuals. So that's really frustrating. The other thing that can come up is because you're often using a lot of hormones or have used a lot of hormones, sometimes there can be some cysts or fibroids happening in the uterus. So, or actually even in the ovaries. So when you get a cyst, that needs to be dealt with often because that can interrupt the whole hormonal flow. So I'm just going to say that if there is something coming up, an obstacle, there are interventions that are used for thin lining. So if you have thin lining, or your surrogate has thin lining, or you have a friend or you know someone who has a thin lining, there are interventions for thin lining. So that's really great. It's usually standard all across clinics. I think that's probably true internationally as well, that you're looking at estrogen, some kind of estrogen supplementation. So more estrogen or longer period of estrogen use. The other thing that you can use for thin lining that is a little bit more experimental, so not all clinics are going to offer this, but it's just something you should know, is that sometimes Viagra is used to help the lining. And then a more popular thing now that is definitely not as offered at clinics and is expensive is something called PRP, which is palette-rich plasma infusion. So there are a number of things basically to know, that if you have thin lining, you're worried about thin lining, that there are interventions for that. Sometimes there's a low-dose aspirin used as well for thin lining. So if you're listening and you have concerns about your lining, you can talk to your care team about those options. Now, of course, we're always looking at lifestyle, whether you have thin lining or not. So things to do to prep do include really looking at what you're putting in your body, light exercise, acupuncture, these kinds of things, relaxation. These things are good to do alongside for your transfer prep. When we're looking at transfers, we're really looking at two different types of transfers. Nowadays, as I said before in previous episodes, most people are doing frozen embryo transfers, FET, F-E-T. It's not as common to do a fresh transfer, although some clinics will experiment with a fresh transfer. I think particularly for a person who's not going to go do PGTA testing. So if you're not going to genetically test your embryos, that is an option sometimes for women using eggs that are maybe on the quote older, in quote, older side. But normally in the US, especially here in the US, we are looking at frozen embryo transfers at this point, which was not as true, I think, a few decades ago, or even more recent. But now the trend is very much frozen embryo transfer to let the body reset, and to have the capability to do genetic testing, which is very big here in the United States. Now, so when we're looking at frozen embryo transfers, we're really looking at two different types of transfers that clinics and care teams tend to talk about. That is the medicated transfer. And then that's also the non-medicated transfer, which clinics and people tend to call natural. I don't like that word, but we'll use it for the episode because that's what people know as the other alternative to medicated. For a medicated cycle, that's pretty common. That tends to be the more common transfer option. It is estrogen for a couple weeks, usually pill, sometimes patch, and then the progesterone injections. There's no ovulation during that transfer cycle. Clinics and people like it because it's easy to control. You can really determine the time and when you will transfer. So if you're on a schedule or the clinic's on a schedule, this is a very convenient transfer. It also requires less monitoring of the uterus generally. It's pretty, like compared to the retrieval, it's a pretty straightforward, simple process. You're using, tend to use a little less medication and are just taking blood and less ultrasounds for the medicated option. Now, for the natural cycle, if you are a person who ovulates pretty regularly and has normal, or your surrogate or your partner is someone who has regular cycles, ovulates pretty normally, has pretty predictable cycles, that might be an option for you. And this one uses less medication. It goes along the natural rhythm of the body and really works with the natural estrogen that's happening in the body. However, it does require more monitoring because your clinic is wanting to see how your lining's growing, if you've ovulated or not. And then typically in that natural cycle, typically in the US, you are usually triggering ovulation. And then pretty standard now in the natural cycle, transfer cycle, is some progesterone supplementation. So you might find yourself, if you're doing that, needing to supplement that progesterone. So you might still be doing the injections, even though you followed your body's natural estrogen development and maybe didn't have any other medications. There is a bit of a hybrid for some women who have something like PCOS or who are really wanting to make sure that they get their lining, estrogen lining thick enough, which is a stimulated FET, frozen embryo transfer, where you start with letrozole. You might start with actually some of the FSH that you're using your retrieval just to get things moving, and then really trying to recruit one follicle. That kind of hybrid is a little less common. The more common ones are honestly the medicated frozen embryo transfer, and then the natural natural transfer cycle is an option. So definitely, if you're listening and you're listening to this even outside the US, you can think about that and talk to your care team about that and see if that is an option if you like the idea of having a cycle with a little less hormones, but that does mean a lot of monitoring. So just to recap, we have for our IVF transfers, we sometimes expect some cancellations, which might mean something like a cyst or a fibroid, which you want to find on hysteroscopy. Check the previous episode for tests and a little bit of discussion about that. And then sometimes an obstacle is thin lining, but there are interventions for thin lining. And really in the US and most places now are using frozen embryo transfers and staying away from fresh embryo transfers. And within the frozen embryo transfers, there are two main types of transfers, which is the medicated transfer, which allows for more flexibility and control, specifically if you're wanting to know more about when you might do the transfer, have a concrete day. And then there, of course, it means that there is medication with that medicated cycle. And then the natural cycle, which requires more monitoring, is a little less predictable. You don't know when you're going to do your transfer because you're following your body's natural rhythm. It does mean that you're using less medication, but that there is some more monitoring that is required. That concludes our episode for today. I want to hear from you. What did I miss here about transfers? I want to put a plug for our next week's episode. I have an amazing guest coming on. I'm so excited. I'm going to give you a little clue. This person is a renowned RE globally, and she is the egg quality expert. I'll say that again, egg quality expert. So if you think you know who I'm talking about, you can send me an email just to see if you're right. I will respond if I can. Otherwise, stay tuned. If you have a friend that might be interested, send them this episode and let them know about the next episode for our exciting guest. You can reach me at my website, alexandragarystock.com, my email, alexandrapsychotherapy@gmail.com. Until next time, remember, you are not alone.